to achieve some of Sir Paul's aims. And at the end, I'm going to outline a scheme that I'm working on that will do that in my area of science communication. We have with us one of the country's leading proponents of not only open source software, but the philosophy that goes with it, in Mike O'Connor. We have a journalist with us on the panel, Toby Manhire, who's not only one of the best working in the mainstream media in New Zealand today, but he has thought deeply about the future of our media and the role it will play in connecting people with news, information, and ideas in a purely digital publishing world, which isn't that far away. The idea of a daily newspaper is almost extinct. And it's with the media, which is really close to my heart as a journalist, that I want to start. A gentleman stood up yesterday from Waikato University and said at the microphone effectively that the media is letting us down, that its tendency towards the sensational, the dramatic, the controversial, its obsession with balance, and not on the balance of evidence where the evidence may be firmly weighted on one side, but on opposing talking heads. And he said that this is misrepresenting science and potentially misinforming the public. You know, we see immunologist versus anti-vaxxer, geneticist versus G-free campaigner. It's great TV. It's great for those text-in polls, 99 cents a text. But it's hopeless for the public's understanding of science. And to be clear, the public still gets most of its information about science from the mainstream media, even if it's coming across it via Twitter. Let's be clear, the media is in dire straits. I don't think the general public realizes just how disruptive the hyperconnectivity of the internet has been on the media, on the migration of content online, on the influence of social media, on the drying up of classified ads and display ads in newspapers. This has been the cash cow of the media since newspapers began, when they only ran ads on the front page, and that revenue is dwindling. It's not being replaced quickly enough in the online world. Newsrooms, as a result, are smaller. Journalists work harder with less resources. They're generally younger and less experienced, and they don't have specialist knowledge. And we expect them to turn out informed reports and commentary on issues as diverse as stem cell research, climate change, obesity, and the Higgs boson. It's too hard. Our commercial media is struggling to cope. Our public broadcasters are under pressure. Radio New Zealand does a fantastic job, particularly in science, but they're under pressure, have tight resources. TVNZ7 is into its last month of broadcast. Now a lot of people are asking, how do we maintain healthy journalism to in turn maintain a healthy democracy, to inform the public, to speak truth to power, to root out corruption? Some people are worried that it isn't going to exist in a world where it doesn't rate as well as the GC or New Zealand's Got Talent. New models of public interest journalism are emerging overseas as a result of this trend, which is global, and they may offer some answers, and Toby is going to talk to this later in his presentation. But the state of the media is only part of the problem. Science now more than ever has to do a better job of articulating the issues and the science. Even when the issues are controversial, antagonistic, we need scientists to front up. You know, at the Science Media Centre, our job is basically to act as a brokering service between science and the media. The media need good talent, quotable quotes, well-articulated interviewees. When we can help people who meet these requirements, and I want to thank all the people in this room who stood up time and time again when we need these people to stand up to the media. When we find those people, it's good for science. The outcome is always good. It's when science is inarticulate or worse, has nothing to say on an issue, that we run into problems. The media has a void to fill, and they will fill it. And if you're an expert in your field who won't front to the media will find someone who will, and that person might be an activist, a vested interest, or someone peddling pseudoscience. So science needs to do a better job of connecting with the media for everyone's benefit. We need to facilitate more open discussion, allow and encourage scientists in our CRIs and universities to engage in independent commentary, and reward them for it as well, reward them for doing science communication. That's why we set up SciBlogs, this blogging network, 30 scientists blogging about their areas of expertise, because we weren't seeing that level of discourse happening in the mainstream media. It's that sort of openness that can't really be avoided anyway in this age of almost radical transparency, where information is free-flowing and fast-flowing. The biggest change, I think, in the last 15 years is the one that really is the most influential since Gutenberg's press. It's the access to information the internet has facilitated. Hand in hand with that, we've seen communities sharing knowledge, intellectual property, and computer code to build open source software. From Facebook, which boasts 900 million users, if not a very good share price, to Google Android, to Wikipedia, to WordPress, which the Science Media Center and Sciblogs is based on. Open source technologies have become integral to the largest online businesses that exist. And Mike has some fantastic examples of this in New Zealand. But it's more than just software, bits of code. The philosophy and the technology infiltrates open science. You know, the Human Genome Project, SETI at home are just two big examples of many. Open government, open data, the opening of geospatial information. This philosophy that's grown out of open source software infiltrates all of those things, and we can take advantage of that. The potential for New Zealand businesses, scientists, the government to connect with each other and the rest of the world using open source tools is tremendous. It means that a kid in Tolaga Bay Area School who is interested in gadgets could use a credit card sized computer. They call it the Raspberry Pi. It costs about $45. To build an app that could be available for sale in the rest of the world via the Google Android store. We can do that. In the online world, at least, the world is flat, and long may it remain that way. The thing I love about the internet is that it's the great leveler. You know, Angry Birds could have been created here in Gisborne. We've got the imagination and the talent. What we don't seem to have is the connections to make a real go of making our online businesses fly on a global scale. It's a fickle world at the best of times, particularly in the startup world, but we need to do better at making our good ideas connect with the rest of the world. We used to be a test bed for technology in New Zealand. I know this because when I was the technology editor at the New Zealand Herald, I got all the gadgets first. Vodafone would test handsets and services here first, like their video phone. It was the first country they rolled it out to test it. Then they would unleash it on the US or Europe if it was successful here in New Zealand. Everyone knows what was achieved when the first unified FPOS system was developed in New Zealand. This trend seems to have tailed off a bit. For some reason, those connections seem to be made elsewhere in the world. 10 years ago, I was writing stories about tech companies like Motorola, Intel, and Oracle weighing up whether to base R&D labs in New Zealand as opposed to Queensland or Singapore. The same went for the big pharmaceutical companies. We don't really seem to hear much about this anymore. I'm not even sure if we're on their radar. As Sir Peter said yesterday, we need to connect with the multinationals who can bring serious scale to our high-tech and high-value industries. You know, Peter Jackson's Weta Empire now boasts 1,000 employees, 700 off the Kiwis. Imagine if we had a handful of equivalents in the software, cloud computing, or hardware business, or even the drug business, doing R&D clinical trials here on that scale. You know, maybe a connecting flight to Sydney wouldn't look so appealing. David Skilling argues, and I agree with him, that we are still a perfect lab for the rest of the world, a place where we can test ideas, research, and develop services and technology, roll out policies that we can take internationally. David, incidentally, back when he was heading the New Zealand Institute, developed a very influential report that set out the benefits to the economy of rolling out ultra-fast broadband. That's happening now, and it will get to Gisborne and other regional centres as well. But is it ambitious enough? Consider this, by 2015, the amount of data crossing the internet every minute will be equivalent to the total size of all movies ever made. By then, annual internet traffic will reach a zettabyte. That's 1 billion terabytes, roughly 200 times the total size of all words ever spoken by humans. The speed and capacity we're aiming for in the next 7 to 8 years will only serve to bring us up to speed with what the rest of the developed world enjoys now. And are we doing enough to develop the services that will employ the speed to better serve New Zealand communities with e-health, teleworking, entertainment, and productivity services? Think, for instance, of the difference Google Maps has made to business, to the geospatial information industry, to personal navigation. You know, it was Google Maps that I used on Tuesday to give me turn-by-turn instructions to bring me to the Portside Hotel on my smartphone. Craig Nevill-Manning is one of the engineers who invented Google Maps. And these are services we sort of take for granted but are so integral now to our online experience. Another invention Craig was involved in that straddles technology and science is Google flu trends. Google found that certain search terms are good indicators of flu activity. So Google Flu Trends uses aggregated Google search data to estimate current flu activity around the world in almost real time. You know, Google changed the internet by connecting up the world's information. Whether we are doing business, research, interacting in a social sense, how do we here in New Zealand take advantage of the unprecedented access to information we now have? This level playing field that allows us to participate in global markets, connect with people. If we can't capitalize on this to a greater extent, we're squandering an opportunity. You know, Stephen Hawking said, all we need to do is make sure we keep talking. That's great, but we also need action as well. And I think action of an exponential kind, because that's the type of change we are witnessing in this hyper-connected world. It's exponential, and that's the type of action Sir Paul would have wanted us to pursue. Thanks, and I'll now hand over to Craig Nevill-Manning.
Thank you, Peter. Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was glad to make it here. Christchurch is looking beautiful right now, but a little impractical to fly out of. So I'm going to go rogue a little bit. I'm here as a technologist, but I'm going to talk about something actually slightly different. I'm going to let you in on the secret of Google's expansion internationally in terms of its engineering offices and collaboration. So the secret to Google collaborating globally to produce all of these projects is airplanes. So I set out for New York, I guess 2003, as part of Google to found their first engineering center outside of Mountain View, which is the headquarters. And I spent a lot of time getting the best video conferencing equipment, making sure people were used to communicating with instant messaging and so on. I spent a lot of time with Larry and Sergey and Eric and execs, explaining that it was important for them to explain their vision in emails, not just sort of in the hallways where people were locally. I talked to them about getting up early in the morning or staying up late at night so they could video conference in real time with engineers across the world. And we've got some of the smartest technologists, I think, around the world at Google. But I spent a lot of time with a lot of them explaining how to add 3 and subtract 5 to figure out what time it was in another time zone. It's kind of flabbergasting. So I did a lot of work on that, and with the assumption that with technology the way it is, we could use that to collaborate. So it turns out that all that's great stuff, but none of it works without airplanes. So we spend a lot of money flying people to and fro. So basically, whenever we start a project, the most important thing is to get a bunch of people on a plane to the place with the other people they'll be working on. So, for example, from New York back to Mountain View or from Zurich down to Sydney, and put them up in hotels and have them spend a couple of weeks in the same room, at the same whiteboard, going to lunch together, collaborating. And that's what makes or breaks a project at Google. After that, pretty much you can collaborate by email, you can video conference and use all this fabulous technology, but it doesn't work unless there's that physical connection. When I went back to California on a regular basis when I started up the office, it turned out the most valuable thing for me being there was walking down the hallway and bumping into somebody I hadn't seen for a while and saying, so what are you working on now? And I'd learned stuff that I never would have learned otherwise. I wouldn't have scheduled a meeting with them, I wouldn't have sent them an email, but that information turned out to be critical to the next project in New York, or the way we were collaborating and so on. So it's an incredibly advanced technological world we live in, but there's still nothing like what we're doing now, sitting in the same room and talking to each other and having coffee with each other. And I think if Google, I think we're pretty good at technology generally, and if we need planes and we need hotels to collaborate, I suspect lots of other organizations do as well. So New Zealand is generally pretty good at travel. I mean, how many of you have been to Europe? Okay, almost everybody in the room. So when you go to Europe from New Zealand, it's my experience that on the way, heck, you may as well stop in Hong Kong, and gosh, on the way back, you better stop in LA and so on. You better pack a lot into those trips, and people in the US are amazed at the crazy kind of trip. It's kind of, Captain Cook in reverse. He got to Tahiti, and then he opens the envelope, and he's like, well, I'm going to discover New Zealand. For the Europeans at least. So but it's us in reverse. We have this long itinerary, which is terrific. But unfortunately, I'm going to argue that we need to go further. And in particular, and I'm going to be a bit US-centric here, but I think there's a huge value to actually spending, say, a year in a place. I think you learn a lot spending a long time in a place and having a permanent address and having a local credit card and living the life there to really understand what it means to compete internationally. I'm involved with the Beachheads program, and the first company I met with was moving to the US, was opening their business in the US and building a website. And we looked at the prototype website, and it just wasn't that great. And the reason it wasn't that great was not for technological reasons. It's that none of the people in the company had, for example, lived in the US and got used to Amazon with Prime, which means that from your cell phone, when the fancy strikes you, you open up an app and say, I need one of those, and it's one click, and it's immediately it's delivered free a couple of days later to your house. And doing that over and over and over again, kind of at the drop of a hat. And then you understand what the bar is, what the expectation is for e-commerce sites, for example, in the US. I met with another business person from New Zealand just recently, actually. And he was sort of F this and F that, and he sort of looked at me and said, you know, I'm a bit crass, I'm a West Aucklander. You know, it turns out that that kind of approach doesn't work very well in the US. And the West Auckland thing, you know, it doesn't transfer particularly well. There's a kind of a level of polish in the US that I've come across that, you know, I think everybody has a sense of, right? You know, it comes across sometimes as Americans are very good at self-promotion. But what I realized was, you know, I don't know about you, but as a Kiwi, I sort of have this tendency to apologize for myself. So if somebody gives you a compliment, of course, the expected thing in New Zealand is to explain to that person why, of course, you don't deserve it. This is not part of the American culture. That's not a negative thing about the US culture. It's not completely clear to me that it's healthy to have to do this explanation all the time. But I applied for an academic job in the US and had a letter written for me by my postdoc advisor from Stanford and by my advisor back from New Zealand. And honestly, they were talking about two completely different people. And it turned out that none of the actual facts differed. There was some sort of, you know, there was some sort of choosing of facts, I think, that probably differed. My New Zealand advisor, you know, felt that he had to present a balanced perspective. And it turns out a balanced perspective is not necessarily what you want when you're applying for a job. You know, I got the job, but I was kind of stunned at this reference letter that my U.S. advisor had written. So there's all these little cultural things, you know, even living there and going to the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, or dealing with Homeland Security, which is quite some organization, for a visa or a green card. You realize the level of scale of these US organizations, the inflexibility of the organizations, the low tolerance for informality in these organizations. And I think it's not until you sort of experience that firsthand and for some period of time that you understand what the difference is between doing business in New Zealand and doing business at sort of 100x scale in the US. And again, I know I'm talking about the US because that's my experience. I suspect the same is true in Asia and Europe. And I'm also making grand generalizations, which are not universally true, but certainly some of these things have been true in my experience. So I guess what I'm proposing, and I'm not sure exactly what the mechanism could be, is we need more sabbaticals. So academics do this reasonably well, although I think even academics need to do this better and better. But to find a way to go somewhere, to embed yourself in the US or Asia or Europe for a year, settle down, put down roots, live the life, and sort of really soak yourselves, embed yourselves in that culture. You know, allow yourself to be dismayed by the differences between New Zealand and some of the larger economies and more complicated economies, but then to learn from that and then get cracking on expanding US businesses, New Zealand businesses into those amazingly large markets that we have huge opportunities in. Thanks.
Well, good morning. Firstly, let me just start by saying how strongly I agree with what Craig said. People-to-people matter, face-to-face matters. Being offshore in place for a sustained period of time really matters. The world, I have to disagree a little bit, I don't think the world is flat. The world is actually pretty lumpy. And being in place matters a lot. So the topic of my remarks is from the ends of the earth. given as how we are at the ends of the earth. Gisborne is a long way, it turns out, from anywhere. The only other time, this is my first time in Gisborne, it turns out, except I have flown over Gisborne once. When I was flying from Auckland to Santiago in Chile. I thought the pilot had made a mistake. He was tracking southeast over Gisborne. But that's about as close as I've got. But it's fair to say that if not exactly at the end of the earth, it's pretty close. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about New Zealand's place in the world in that context, in the context of our physical realities. And I'd like to frame my ideas around ideas. James Cook arrived in New Zealand in 1769 as part of a voyage of ideas associated with the transit of Venus, and then as we learnt, opening the sealed envelope and getting the lucky draw to come to New Zealand. And this heralded, in a formal sense, the start of European engagement with New Zealand. And it's interesting to think about the time at which that engagement happened, 1769, and the 71 years between 1769, when Cook arrived here, in 1840, when the Treaty of Waitangi was signed. It was essentially the birth of a modern West. We had Declaration of Independence in the US, 1776, French Revolution in 1789, the Industrial Revolution really took off in the UK, the expansion of the British Empire, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith was written. It was a time of unprecedented intellectual, philosophical, scientific, industrial inquiry. And that is part of New Zealand's DNA. That was a context in which the British Empire settled New Zealand, warts and all. But even the Treaty of Waitangi was an innovation in the context of British Empire compared to, for example, what they did across the Tasman. And so this international context, to me, is very much embedded in New Zealand's history. We were part of that process of international exploration, of scientific inquiry, the voyage of discovery. And yet, despite those international embedded beginnings, it seems to me that we seldom now think about New Zealand in an international context. Yes, we travel, as Craig said, we travel vast distances oftentimes, but it seems to me we don't often think about New Zealand in that international context, and I think that's a problem, and I think it has serious consequences, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that now. We have, it seems to me, very much an islanders mentality. We see ourselves as independent and apart. You know, although we are exposed to global economic and political and other trends as a small country, we still see the world as a black box. It's kind of over there somewhere. And we kind of register it because we watch for TV or read the newspapers, but stuff is happening in Greece or stuff is happening in Syria. We kind of get that, but it's over there. And it might affect us if they want to buy less of our logs or less of our cheese. But it doesn't affect us in a visceral day-to-day sense. And it's not something that we should try and understand particularly or engage with. And we worry a little bit about economics and trade, but we seldom worry about ideas, it seems to me. And that is a problem. We are, it strikes me, a remarkably introspective society. And particularly now, having lived away from New Zealand for the last 3.5 years, it strikes me even more acutely every time I come back at how inward-looking our conversations are. Every country has inward-looking conversations. The US has inward-looking conversations, which is amusing, but there are also 300+ million people. They can afford to do that. If you're 4 and a bit million people, I'd argue somewhat less so. And partly, of course, that's due to our physical remoteness. If you're in the middle of Europe or middle of Asia, there's a lot of other people to talk about and to think about. So in a sense, physical isolation gives us something of an excuse, but we are introspective. But it seems to me that we need to over-invest in overcoming our physical remoteness and trying to shed our introspective constraints and inhibitions. And it seems to me particularly it's overcoming the intellectual tyranny of distance that matters. We're all familiar with the tyranny of distance, but it takes a long time for our logs and our people to get to overseas markets and overseas locations. But I think it's the intellectual tyranny of distance, the flow of ideas, of people, of contact, relationships, and networks. And yes, technology is a partial substitute to Craig's point, but not a complete one. It's interesting that some economists did a study of Twitter quite recently. I forget the exact number, but it was circa 90% of Twitter relationships were in a 5-mile circumference of the person. So these things reinforce existing social relationships, which is certainly consistent with my experience as well. So it's about ideas, it's about relationships, and it's about networks, it seems to be, where New Zealand needs to be investing. Former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating, a somewhat controversial figure in New Zealand sometimes, noted a few years back, quote, "Because out here on the edge of Asia, a long way from major markets and natural groupings, ideas are all Australia has to shield itself from the harsh winds of global change." Indeed. and even more so for New Zealand, it seems to me. And it seems to me that we need to have investments in deep understandings of the structural changes that are underway in the world, and there are many. We've heard some of them in the opening remarks. They are technological, social, economic, political, and these changes are even more fundamental than many of the changes 250 years ago that I spoke about earlier, the Industrial Revolution, empire, scientific inquiry. And also thinking about how we respond to those new realities. And we can't just say we're a long way away. Ideas don't respect distance. They are going to affect us. The rise of China and emerging markets is going to shape our future in ways that we don't yet even understand or, frankly, are talking about particularly. And it's not just understanding what's happening and the effect on us, it's also understanding how we might, as a country and as individuals, contribute to that process. And I think that's very much a theme of the forum. If ideas can impact us out here on the ends of the earth, as Cook did in 1769, but it seems to me also in reverse, that ideas from here can shape the rest of the world. Scientific ideas, to be sure, but also political, economic, social, and others. A friend of mine, Brian Sweeney, came up with the idea of the edge as a metaphor for New Zealand. New Zealand on the edge, obviously, physically. But the metaphor was one of biology. In organisms, I'm told, as it will become abundantly clear, I'm not a biologist, change and innovation happens on the edge of organisms. And the idea was, in a reasonably unconstrained environment, as New Zealand is, without a long history of the type that you see in Europe and elsewhere, we are sort of a young country on the edge, fewer of the constraints. We are, or at least could be, an incubator for ideas and for creativity. And indeed, small countries generally do seem to generate a disproportionate amount of intellectual innovation. But I think here's the trick. Let's not just be a caricature of the L&P ad. We're world famous in New Zealand, which is how we think about it. And world class is possibly the most overused term in New Zealand. We're world class this, we're world class that. Frankly, it's not true. You know this because when you go to the rest of the world and ask, they have no idea. Except in particular spots where we do have genuine claims to being world class. But we need to develop an international reputation for ideas and expertise, and to be recognised as such. And too often, or too infrequently, do we reverse the telescope and ask what other people actually think of us. We're so busy patting ourselves on the back. And this should be, it seems to me, at the cornerstone of our brand. We should be a country rather of people and ideas, not just lakes and mountains. It does strike me when you're overseas and looking at the various bits of New Zealand tourism collateral, it's not actually obvious that anyone lives in New Zealand. You see the occasional mountain biker, but it's about as much as it gets, which is fine, and it is part of the beauty of the place. I get that, and it presumably works, or they wouldn't keep doing it. But it's a problem, because it communicates that we're actually not serious about ideas. We're not serious about people. We're not serious about connections. So I'm not saying we should throw that out necessarily, but I think there needs to be a much more balanced view, both of ourselves in terms of how we see ourselves, but also of a way in which we present to the rest of the world. New Zealand flatters itself sometimes as a laboratory of the world. I'm not quite sure I said New Zealand is a perfect laboratory. I think perhaps New Zealand could be, which is not quite the same thing. But New Zealand did have a reputation, it's certainly true, for being the laboratory of the world. If you go back to over 100 years back, issues of women's suffrage, issues of being a pioneer in the provision of social insurance, reforms of the 1980s, all of these were ideas that resonated well beyond New Zealand's borders. People took notice, people fought, in many cases people replicated, people beat a path to the doors of New Zealand to find out what was going on, what we did, and what they could learn. I'm not so sure that's still the case. Are people still beating a path to New Zealand to find out what our ideas are, how we're thinking, what we're proposing to do? Are we still seen as that incubator of ideas? Not as much, I think, as we would like. And as a country, we've certainly got no shortage of truly exceptional individuals. But I think that there is something of a disconnect between exceptional New Zealand individuals, many of them in the room, and many others as well, who are risk-seeking, innovative, full of drive and ambition and energy and networked, and New Zealand a collective entity. And I think as a society, we've got to think hard about the kind of culture, the kind of attitudes that we want to inculcate and to develop. And as a society, it seems to me that we need to invest in ideas. We do, I think, have something of an anti-intellectual streak in New Zealand. It's partly because we're a nation of islanders and we're pioneers and all the rest of it, but I think that's a problem. The world is built on ideas, be they scientific or technological ideas, be very ideas about how to run a society, economic and social and the like. We need to invest in ideas. Ideas need topsoil. They need to be nourished, they need to be invested in. I think in New Zealand we need to over-invest because we're out of the flow. We're physically separate from many of the conversations that Craig was talking about. It's not as straightforward, it's not as cheap to get on a plane. Serious countries need to take ideas seriously. And I think fundamental to this conversation at this conference and many of our national conversations is, are we a serious country? Or are we a lifestyle country? And that to me is fundamentally what a lot of this boils down to. Serious countries take ideas seriously. There's a famous saying from a French philosopher a few hundred years back, René Descartes, who said, "I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum." And the parallel statement, it's been remarked, is that countries that do not think cease to exist. And the issue is, are we thinking hard as a country? Because countries that don't think, that let themselves go, that aren't innovating, that aren't thinking about their future, that aren't having national conversations about these things, go soft and flabby. And it worries me that we're not being as serious as we need to. We need to overinvest, it seems to me, given where we are. We need to engage with much greater seriousness of purpose to develop the next generation of ideas. And that means engaging internationally. This is not a New Zealand endeavour. Yes, it needs to be grounded in New Zealand realities. It needs to serve the New Zealand population. But also, I'd claim, for New Zealand to really hit what it's capable of doing, we need to have a reputation for contributing to the world. You know, what are our ideas that are making an impact, both in New Zealand, but also on the world stage? New Zealand's place, it seems to me, should be in generating the ideas that provide insight and guidance to the world in terms of how they should live environmentally, economically, socially. The phrase that I like to use is New Zealand as an intellectual insurgent. We should be taking full advantage of our relative youth as a country, our lack of constraints, our openness, all of the great stuff that makes New Zealanders great, but scaling that up so those are national characteristics, not just characteristics of New Zealanders as people. And that seems to me is the trick. And I'd like to think that this gathering can be the start. Ideas from the ends of the earth that go to the rest of the world. So we need to stop thinking about ourselves as separate and other and independent of the world, and see ourselves as part of that world and as a core part of our national mission to contribute ideas to that world. Thank you.
What a spectacular speech. Thank you, David. Look, good morning, everyone. I'm Mike O'Connor. I'm a director of CatalystIT. CatalystIT are in the technology game. We're software developers. We use technologies to build software and systems for our clients. 15 years ago, before we formed Catalyst, the four founders were software developers. In those days, we used other people's technologies to build systems for our clients called proprietary systems. So someone owned the software we used to build our systems. There came at a price to us. There was a price to our clients. They had to pay a license. There was an exclusivity, the contract we had with the purveyor of that intellectual property we used. It did what we did. We didn't have access to the source code, so there came a point when we were limited in the sort of systems we could build. We were limited by the functionality of the software we had. And of course, the release cycles were determined by someone else. We had very little influence over it. That was just the way it was. We managed to make money out of it, and you know, successful business models abounded around that. But when we decided to form Catalyst 15 years ago, we had a certain sense that we didn't want to behave like that. We didn't want to be under someone else's control. We wanted some freedom, control of our own destiny, and I guess we wanted a different relationship with our clients where we didn't have to sell them this piece of technology and tell some lies that it could do everything for them. That was just the way we were. And fortunately, 15 years ago, it coincided with the development and sort of the maturation of some very serious and capable open source technologies. The sort of technologies we need is things you may hear of: databases, languages, operating systems, web servers, code management software, and all this sort of arcane stuff. But that was the building blocks of the services we offered. And open source came about, and there were some very spectacular technologies at that time. the things that distinguished open source for us, and some of the better known elements to it, or facets to it, is that it's license free. So pretty important for a startup company where literally has no money if you can get hold of all this intellectual property without a license. So you get access to the source code. So that kind of to us meant we never had to tell a client, no, it can't do that, because we could change the source code to make it to do it. The other thing about open source is it encourages certain behaviours, and we've heard a lot of words and themes running through some of the sessions of collaboration, of sharing, of connecting, and of community. Because open source is community-based software. There's a group of people who have an interest in its development, and all those involved feed into its health and its longevity and its success. And we kind of quite like that. You end up having a different relationship with the people also involved in it, and you're all working towards its mutual benefit. And of course the clients enjoyed all those advantages as well, and the additional advantages of kind of control of their own destiny. Our clients don't have a really hard contract with us. They can kick us out whenever they like. We don't own the intellectual property, they own it as much as we do. So we're only as good as the services we offer them, and control of their own destiny, and actually the removal of vendor lock-in is one of the advantages clients now say is one of the greatest advantages of open source. So that's how we formed a little bit of a background about Catalyst. So off we went. We developed a website for Plumbing World, actually, about 14 years ago. Fortunately, it coincided with good old CityLink laying fibre down the terrace in Wellington. And so for $5,000, they shot a line up Morrison Kent House to the 20th floor there. We had a little pokey office there. And all of a sudden, we literally had the server in the cupboard, serving our very first client, Plumbing World, who happily we still have as a client. And so from there we've moved on. And so to this, this time, when you view some of the online news, I'm sorry it's sort of shagging over the traditional news organisations, but most of the online news in New Zealand is served on open source systems that Catalyst have or still have something to do with. When you put in a .nz domain, or a domain in a browser that ends in .nz, that website is served, the address is resolved through a system, an open source system that we've built and maintained. When you have a sneaky bet on the TAB, that's us, unfortunately. You've got to have a little advice in your company every now and again. And when you get your electoral roll, that is an open source system. So as you can see, there's some quite serious systems. Electoral roll actually is has to be very secure there. We get whacked for a lot of money if that gets hacked. So open source can scale, it's mature and is secure. And when you vote in the next general election, that's a open source system that we've developed and host. And in fact, Peter, if one of the outcomes of this forum is the formation of a political party, underpinned by science, I can assure you that our system will handle it. And if we could turn the streaming off, we'll see what we can do about a favourable outcome at the next general election, perhaps. I'm sure something can be arranged. Righto. And of course, New Zealanders punch above our weight, as you'd expect, in developing open source technologies. I'll just mention a couple of them. Oh God. Out of Auckland University, back in the late 90s, came a product called R. R is a statistical analysis and display. It takes big, complex data and enables you to represent it and make some sense out of it. And actually, Sean, our resident theoretical physicist, used it to help in his presentation yesterday morning. Fantastic. So 12 years on, that product is still used by many international scientific-based institutions around the world. And in fact, we also use it for some of our broadband measurement analysis as well. Silverstripe, a Wellington company, developed a content management system and kind of famously in 2008 it was used to run the 2008 Democratic Convention. that good old Mr. Obama sort of appeared through and is still with us today. And so they earned some fantastic export revenue as a result, and their product and their company is just thriving still at the moment. Fantastic to see. Another one I kind of like is Koha. Koha is a library management system. So back in 1998 or so, the Horowhenua Library Trust decided they needed a new library management system. And they thought they'd build one. And they had about $30,000 or so to build one. And they got a small New Zealand company called Catapo, and they built a system. And then they had the vision to open source it. And what they were really ensuring then, and in that day it was visionary, that they needed someone, a community, a larger community than their own's help to contribute to their product to keep it healthy and survive. So as a result today, a couple of ones I like, the Vatican use Koha to maintain their register and probably maintain some of their secrets too, I'd imagine. The Delhi Public Library uses Koha, the largest public library in the world, a subscription of over 4 million. So here's this fantastic product that's come out of Levin. Of course, the Horowhenua Trust now enjoy the benefits of all the contributions from all these other organisations, including us, and all these other libraries that invest back in that product and make it grow and grow and grow. That's the beauty of open source. Unfortunately, if we take Koha as an example, despite all that success and international recognition, it still wasn't good enough for the New Zealand National Library to shortlist in a recent tender. But that's public sector procurement, and don't get me bloody started on that. All right, okay. Okay, so I'll just finish, I've just got a couple of minutes, unfortunately. So open source, it has some inherent advantages. I think it's good for New Zealand. The startups and the next generation of entrepreneurs here in New Zealand are already using it. They're building the next hyperfactory or TradeMe or Facebook or Google as we speak. So that's all good and sorted. But for your own organisations, I mean, many of you will be in fairly technology-intensive industries or institutions. The next time someone says, geez, we need a new computer system, just put your hand up and say, well, we thought of open source options. And you get extra points if you also add to that. And let's think of using a local supplier. That's rather good for the New Zealand economy. Finally, we need young geeks coming through to fuel our business and our industry. The New Zealand education sector is not well positioned to deliver them for us. The ICT curriculum is kind of pretty rubbish. They're trying to make some improvements. But technology change is relentless and rapid, and there is just simply no hope for some of those fantastic ICT teachers out there in schools to deliver what we need. Catalyst, then realising this context, for the last 2 years have run what we've called the Open Source Academy. Each year in January we get about 20 to 25 kids. We put an emphasis on girls, so it's a good gender balance there. And for 2 weeks we get them into Wellington and we train them in the tools and processes we use to build software for our clients. The same tools that fuel many of the larger international services out there, the Facebooks and Googles and so on. So we try and enthuse them into our industry, make them excited about it, make them realise there's a career path for them, and we train them so that they are job ready. It's no good if we're training them to take off overseas and find a job somewhere else. And there are other organisations doing something similar. And I guess my final point is I don't think we can wait around for someone else to solve the problem of training our next graduates in whatever sphere we're in, scientific, technology, it doesn't matter. It's not going to happen, right? The public sector, the government can't do it, right? We have to kind of reach in there and help these people to create enthusiasm and pathways. And then the very final thing we have to do is give them a job. We have to make an effort to employ these youngsters. Cheers.
Good morning. I'm Toby, and I guess I'm the token mainstream media guy here, which is a bit of a tough gig given some of the things that have been said about mainstream media. the last few days. It could have been worse. I could have worn my I Love GDP t-shirt. There's been quite a lot of talk about you won't get that because you haven't been here for the last few days. It was good. All the talk about communication and connectivity, of course, that's inveigled its way into so many of the discussions, as it has forever, really. Partly, I guess, because science and journalism, when done well, aren't all that different at all, in that they have an investigative ambition, an analysis, and a communicative role. Science journalism, in fact, was around before newspapers, just, in the form of the Royal Society journal Philosophical Transactions. At least that's what it's called now. Back in March 1665, it carried the snappy title, Philosophical Transactions, giving some account of the present undertakings, studies, and labour of the ingenious in many considerable parts of the world. Which I suppose is why they invented sub-editors. And while some might lament the lack of extensive science coverage in newspapers today, scientific ideas are, of course, embedded in the very mastheads of many of the popular newspapers in Britain, specifically astronomical concepts, which is appropriate given the transit of Venus in recent days. There's the Sun, that's there. The Daily Star, sample headline, Jordan's cruel sex taunts killed marriage. It's not Jordan the country. And of course there's the News of the World, or until recently there was the News of the World. Before that newspaper was closed down by its Australian owner, the News of the World was the best-selling English language newspaper in the world. The Sun, owned by the very same Australian, is the best-selling daily newspaper in the UK today. That's followed by the Daily Mail, then the Daily Mirror, then the Daily Star, then the Daily Express. And in defence of our own print media in New Zealand, I'd argue that most of our daily newspapers are better, or certainly more responsible newspapers, than those five. I think some people in New Zealand can imagine that in Britain, everyone is sitting on a train or a tube reading a copy of The Guardian or the Financial Times. The Guardian, the paper I used to work for, and I still contribute important dispatches from New Zealand on subjects like the Marmite shortage. The Guardian is the 10th biggest selling daily newspaper in the UK. Online, it's a different story, of course, and that's part of the bigger story about what the changes in the media. But just by way of illustration, in its dead tree form, The Guardian sells one copy for every 285 heads of population in the UK. The Herald in New Zealand sells one copy for every 26 people. That's not in Auckland, but that's in New Zealand. The argument I really want to make is that the kind of vision for New Zealand's future that we've been discussing over the course of this forum, that vision needs and deserves alongside it an intelligent and nuanced and quality journalism, especially in a country of this size. It's a sort of journalism that the commercial imperative can't often provide. Because when it comes to something like the media, talk about the tyranny of distance, I think it's as much the tyranny of scale. It's no coincidence that the media operation most deeply engaged in this event is Radio New Zealand. And given we're all about ecosystem metaphors this week, I think it's fair to say that the RNZ is in danger of becoming an endangered species. TVNZ is already going the way of the Moa. So at the very least, we should stick up a ring fence around Radio New Zealand. And we should do that because journalism has a democratic function, it has a public interest purpose. I don't need to rehearse all those arguments. As far as science and technology is concerned, we need a deep thinking, intelligent media for all manner of reasons. To celebrate it, to examine it, to interrogate it, but just as much as all that, we need to reflect and replicate in New Zealand's mainstream journalism the kind of rational, evidence-based thinking that should be at the vanguard of our future. Peter mentioned the gentleman from Waikato University who was complaining yesterday about the false balance that you see in stories, and he was calling indeed for some legislation to stop it, which I find rather alarming. But he does have a point. It's called he said, she said journalism, and it's a dangerous trap to fall into. Most journalists have done it, probably at one point or another, or often, and it's dangerous especially when you're covering a complex subject like science. You can call it lazy journalism if you like, but as often as not it's the product of one of two things: the journalistic appetite for conflict, for drama, and or the pressure of time and budget and the resulting sort of fall back into formula. Get a quote from either side and file the fucking thing. all of those pressures tend towards the growth of what Nick Davis of The Guardian calls journalism. That's Nick Davis who in recent times brought the WikiLeaks story to The Guardian and almost single-handedly has driven the phone hacking story that led to the demise of the popular astronomical journal, The News of the World. Journalism describes the kind of robot-like, unquestioning rehashing of press releases into news form, and it's on the rise everywhere in the world. The BBC's Andrew Marr has another phrase. He talks of McNugget journalism. That's the reduction of news into sugary, salty, fatty snack food. Nothing inherently wrong with that. Some of us have been busy blogging and tweeting from this very event, often without an awful lot of profundity, but hopefully that doesn't mean it's without value. But just as fast food has spurned a slow food movement, this fast journalism warrants a corresponding slow journalism. A journalism that interrogates, analyses, investigates, reflects, examines, explains, etc., etc. That doesn't, or certainly shouldn't, mean boring journalism, I'd hasten to add. But if the market won't provide that kind of journalism, how do you do it? For various historical reasons, governments tend not even indirectly to get involved in the business of funding public interest print journalism, though there are good arguments for tax exemptions, perhaps. There's the trust model, as exemplified by The Guardian, which means getting a pot of money and investing it in other media interests to support the core operation, but that's dangerous and tricky, especially in times like this. A wealthy benefactor would be nice. Over in Australia, Graham Wood, the guy who set up whatif.com, has put $15 million into something called the Global Mail over 5 years, which is a not-for-profit news and features website with some senior and experienced journalists on the payroll. Foreign correspondents, good thing. It'd be nice if that could happen. But my hunch is that in a country the size and nature of New Zealand, the best option is to try and push every philanthropic button that you can. The question is what sort of form that takes, and you could try and produce a publication. That's what most people would be inclined to do, create a thing, a bundle of content, which is what a newspaper or magazine is. But given all the changes in the nature of the media, Peter touched on this, the disappearance of classified, the disappearance of advertising, the growth of free online content everywhere. I'm not really sure that sort of model would be the way to go. And so I wonder whether the place to look might be something called ProPublica in the US. It's a horrible think tanky name, ProPublica, but it's a bloody good thing. It launched 5 years ago, funded predominantly by a billionaire couple who were disappointed by the demise of investigative journalism in the US. You might say, oh, to have that level of investigative journalism in New Zealand. And they sought no involvement in editorial decisions. ProPublica also has money from the Knight Foundation and hundreds of other donors. It's got 34 journalists on its payroll. Crucially, it partners with other media. So it will partner with a paper or a radio station or a website, whatever, to provide them with journalism that their bottom lines increasingly can't justify. Last year it collaborated with more than 25 partners on more than 110 stories. Stretched news desks just don't have the money to pay for a senior journalist to go looking for a story for weeks and months, especially if there's no guarantee that they'll come up with anything at all. ProPublica print everything they do on their website too, and then after it's put into the world, it's made available on a Creative Commons basis to whoever wants to publish it for free. And that doesn't mean its website isn't lively in its own right. It's not just some kind of do-gooder syndication service. It has a really lively website full of crowdsourcing inventiveness. It's worth having a look at. But also, and I think this is significant in the media market that we have in New Zealand, it doesn't represent a threat to the existing major players. It says to them, you can't afford to do this stuff. We understand that. We'll do it for you, or we'll do it with you. A number of people have touched this week on the Paul Callaghan maxim of embracing and rather than or. And in its own way, this sort of approach, it seems to me, is very much an and.
Thanks, Toby, and all the panelists. Okay, so we've got about 35 minutes to get some ideas going. So Peter is really keen to have some tangible things we can all do out of this conference, at least things that we can see to start off. So I'm interested in all of you. You know the drill. Come up to the microphone, state your name and your organisation. If you've got a comment to make, try and limit it to about 2 minutes, but we want lots of ideas and questions for the panellists.
Yeah, Kim Campbell here from the EMA. Having just recently returned from living overseas for 10 years, and most recently in Asia, and having spent my entire working life exporting from New Zealand, the comments about being there really resonate with me. It's very easy to get off a plane and think you know something. In fact, you live there and, make a lot of mistakes, you realise that there's so much to learn. So the idea of a sabbatical is a good idea, and particularly for those of you who want to build your business overseas, you just got to go and live there. Otherwise, you're not making the commitment. So, absolutely. But in terms of tangible ideas, I'm reminded one of the sort of first early scientific inventions was the wheel. And it's lasted because simply it was a very simple, easy invention and easy to replicate. So I've got an idea. You heard it here first. Everyone's talking about this connectivity thing and the scientists and business, and I'm painfully aware how difficult it is to get our business community interested in science, because a lot of the businessmen are just busy out there selling stuff, and frankly they'd rather solve the problem themselves badly than get a good solution from smart people. So find a way to get the sort of problem and the solution together. Now we've got all the people here that know about computers and things I don't know anything about, but I've got this killer app. So this is the killer app. You heard it here first. It's Book a Boffin. And the way this works is you have an app on your phone and you post your problem, and you have on the other side you have the people who can provide solutions to the scientific community. And likewise the people in the scientific community who have a problem solved and looking for somebody to sell it can marry up with the two. It's like a speed dating thing for business and science. How's that?
That's a great idea. Yeah.
Now, I've got to kick into this. It's going to cost some money to develop it, so I'll put in $5 grand to kick it off, those who want to go there with me, because I don't have any idea what this costs, how you do it. But any profit goes into a scholarship fund, which we're going to call the Sir Paul Callahan Scholarship Fund, which goes back into science. Now, how's that?
Wow. Great.
I'll leave it there.
Great. You should talk to the Advanced Technology Institute. They just got a whole stack of money from the government to pretty much do that exact thing. So that might be a nice app for them. We'll just go over here and take one over here and then head back.
Yeah, Marcus Wilson, University of Waikato. First of all, can we lose the name Boffin from that? Okay, my question is, we heard Craig talking about sabbaticals and the importance of just being there. I'm coming to the end of a sabbatical myself, and I have to say it's been blinking expensive. Yeah, there's nothing like being there, but your bank account sure hemorrhages while you're there. So who pays for them, or who should pay for them?
Craig?
Oh, I was just throwing it out there. I didn't.
Google scholarship.
Well, I think is this. Oh, yeah. So, I mean, one response is education is quite expensive. I think even in New Zealand now it's expensive to go to university, and in some ways this could be seen as part of your lifelong education. And so even if you barely break even, there's I think it's a pretty valuable investment. Secondly, I don't know your personal circumstances, but if you set it up right, it may not need to be that way. For example, at Google, we give internships, so we like to hire students for the summer, either Northern Hemisphere summer or Southern Hemisphere summer, and we'll pay all their expenses and pay them $6,000 a month to come and work at Google because we desperately want to hire good people. So so there's another opportunity. And I guess New Zealanders are pretty good at traveling the world at a sort of minimal expense, and I suspect operating on a shoestring is one of our core competencies. I also think, though, honestly, that, and I don't know where the money would come from, but this is something that, as a country, we need to invest in. And so I'd say that government also has a role in encouraging this kind of thing.
What about the beachheads? They'll give you at least some office space in San Fran or somewhere to to work out of as a
That's
startup,
right. There's now the landing pad in San Francisco,
Yep.
and I think we need to do more of that. Incidentally, which reminds me of one other thing. The only potential downside of something like the landing pad is that you end up with a bunch of other Kiwis.
Yeah.
And I think the critical thing is to embed yourself in the US and then, attend Kiwi Club events at most, once a month, and the rest of the time hang out with your American colleagues, because that's how you really learn.
Any other comments, David?
This is not directly an answer to your question, although I agree with the response. But I think, be it a year-long sabbatical or just more frequent substantive travel, we've got to get out more. And the number of, sorry Toby, the number of stories in the media beating ministers or officials up for travelling.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
Going overseas, and what are you thinking? It's just ridiculous. We need to be doing much, much more of this. And that can be done in a sort of structured year-long sense, but just getting out there on study tours, on exchange trips, on bringing people in on a much more systematic, which I know, well, I presume happens regularly in academic or in scientific context, but in terms of officials, politicians, because I think we need to overinvest. We're not in the flow of ideas naturally because we are where we are in the world. And so finding ways of bringing people in and being prepared to invest and not seeing it as a junket. Some of them, probably are, then we should stop doing that. But if we're not actually getting out there, having the conversations and meeting the people, we're doing ourselves and the country a great disservice.
Any other comments here?
Well, I guess we get approached by people travelling or looking to just sort of engage with us for a period, and we're willing to pay for that. I think we would feel bloody terrible having someone on at their expense working in our company for 6 months or a period. So I kind of think you might find a direct approach and a little bit of selling yourself may well get you some surprise funding.
Sir, we'll take a question here.
Hi, Lou Krieg from AUT, and just responding to some of the previous questions. So my experience has been that you can find someone overseas that will value what you have to offer and will pay for that. So my PhD was a paid position, and I'm sure other people have managed to fund their overseas stays in similar ways. The question from Kim before, dial-up often, you can dial-up often at AUT, 0800 AUT Research, just a quick plug. IRL, soon to be ATI, had a scientist for a day, AUT ran expert for a day. They're out there, but there is, it is a good idea to have a central place for dropping those needs. And I think it would just take an email distribution list of about 20 email addresses, because each research organisation has a central place for research queries. So maybe that's an idea. My question was just a very minor thing, I guess, but picking up on Toby and on Toby's talk, slow journalism. And what I'm interested in is the public debate that ensues from journalism, especially about contentious scientific issues. And I haven't heard a lot about that today, but I do remember with dismay seeing the comments by the public to NBR articles, for instance, on a range of scientific issues. But we just seem to be dredging the bottom of the barrel with that kind of discourse. How do you create quality public discourse from online journalism? So that's a question for the panel.
Okay. Toby?
Well, that's a subject that media outfits around the world are grappling with. Certainly, if you want to feel melancholy and sad about the world, the NBR comment threads are a good place to go.
Yeah.
In part because of a few decisions that they've taken, including to allow anonymity, not even just pseudonymity, but anonymity. There are all sorts of different approaches in terms of the way you break down the conversations below the line, as it's called. And there are some interesting initiatives. Increasingly, as registration is required and bits of paywalls crop up, one of the consequences of that will be that you filter out a lot of the trolling and the muck, but it's an ongoing struggle.
One of the things that's emerging, and we do it to an extent with SciBlogs, is we open source our content. So we've got 30 scientists on there. There's about 6 or 7 of them here in the room. And we say basically steal our content, take it under Creative Commons or whatever, and the mainstream media is taking that content. And there's an organisation in Australia called The Conversation, It's theconversation.edu.au. It's funded by the universities, and this is curated, edited columns from scientists all over Australia. And that is starting to infiltrate the media because they're giving the content away. They're basically saying, you guys aren't doing the level of discourse in the mainstream media. Here it is on a plate. And so I see an increasing role for that. Any other questions on the media, comments on the media? Nope. We'll roll on to a question over here.
Okay, so I'm Caleb Johnston from the Ministry of Economic Development. It's probably a question more focused, targeted at David, but I found myself agreeing with a lot of what you're saying, but especially about the need to have a bit more of an outward-looking culture in terms of commerce and science. But it's just a question of how you do that. How do you build it at a systematic level?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's a template that you follow, apart from any of the issues that we've been discussing, which is read, get out there, visit, build networks, and it all takes hard work and it takes time. But there's no substitute for doing that. And again, I come back to my point, I think we've got to overinvest because we're small, we're remote, stuff doesn't come to us, and we've just got to get out there. And I think the first step, sounds like Alcoholics Anonymous, is recognising you've got a problem, which is, you know, it doesn't seem to me when you talk to folk that people understand that actually this is important. There is a bit of it, well, it's a junket and you're, you know, going to Paris to go to the OECD, you know, well, have fun. That sounds like, this is actually imperative for doing your job. You know, there's 4 and a bit million of us. We are a very small country. We've got big issues on economic, social, environmental, on and on. We've got some good things to say. We've just got to start getting out there. So that means travel budget. But I mean, it even gets down to very simple things like reading, you know, be it online newspapers, much of which is free. If I had one wish for Wellington, it would be a free subscription for Financial Times for everybody. So at least they are reading some quality international journalism. So I don't think there's a particularly complicated solution. It's just being prepared to invest in it and then doing the basics well and on a sustained basis. And I don't think we have done that, or it's happened in a very sporadic kind of patchy way. We just don't travel very much, and we need to. We talk about being great travellers, and it's kind of true. We do our OE and we go to the Gold Coast.
We travel a lot to Europe.
Yeah, but we don't. But I think there's a big difference between the 2-week sort of Kentucky around Europe and actually going there to think and look and engage and live. It's quite a different thing.
Yeah. Okay. Craig, any comments here?
You said it all.
Yeah. Okay. Great. We'll head back over here.
Hi, my name is Phil Holding from Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I've just returned from 3 years in Indonesia. And I just endorse what David and Craig have said about doing a sabbatical, and I'd just like to add that when you come home, if you really want to feel like you've arrived back in New Zealand, go to a pōwhiri at Tolaga Bay. So thank you very much for that. That was amazing. I guess I wanted to be more positive about scientists. And say that I think scientists can really be an example for New Zealand in terms of this international collaboration. In my experience, scientists are much better at this than business people. You know, up in Indonesia, we would get GNS through about once a month, but we had 1 visit from the meat industry in 3 years, despite Indonesia being the 2nd biggest market for New Zealand beef. So something to think about there. I just want to endorse this concept that we need to know our markets better. The World Bank says that in 2025, 50% of GDP growth is going to come from 6 countries. India, Indonesia, China, Korea, Brazil and Mexico. So I just want to ask the question, who's learning Portuguese or Korean or Bahasa Indonesia or Mandarin at school? I mean, Mandarin a little bit, but we're still learning French and German. Something to think about. In terms of just an example about collaboration, which we've talked about quite a lot, we had something called the World Geothermal Congress in Indonesia, 2010. New Zealand basically built the Indonesian geothermal industry. We had this Congress and we had about 60 New Zealand scientists and business people coming up, and they all did individual stands in the exhibition. And the country that did it the best was Australia. They had a huge Australian stand. What does Australia know about geothermal? Nothing. But New Zealand can do everything for you in geothermal, but the guy who makes the pipes doesn't like talking to the guy who does the modelling, who builds the generators, you know, and just we have to get sort of above this parochialism that we tend to have in New Zealand. And my final thing for giving props to New Zealand scientists, I think the flip side of Craig's story about the West Auckland effing this and effing that, it may be apocryphal, I hope it's real, but a story about New Zealand geothermal engineer in the 1970s. Indonesia has really bad bureaucracy and you can't get anything done, it takes you ages. And these guys pleading for a road to be built to this geothermal plant. And while they were doing this week or 2 weeks of negotiation, they came back and the road was built. And the reason was because the New Zealand guy, who's the geothermal scientist, got on a bulldozer and built it himself. And so I guess, this isn't really a question, but all I was going to say is, if we can keep that kind of can-do attitude and put your hand to anything, but be a little bit more sophisticated and know the markets will be a bit better, we have the ingredients already, we can do this really well. So.
Right. Madam.
Hello, I'm Yvonne Curtis from New Zealand Futures Trust, and I'm actually bringing a message from Panamu and to say that we have now had over 4,000 cards played in the game.
Wow.
And people are so keen they got started before we got there this morning. But this is a fairly simple question, actually has partly been answered. Are we exploiting to the full the connectivities that we have? So crowdfunding, the crowdsourcing, Telespace and Kickstarters and so on. So can we really make creative use of those?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Mike, maybe you have some perspective on this, because a lot of software projects now are crowd-funded, people going out looking for micropayments. It's potentially a model for the media as well, so there's maybe a couple of areas there we can look at.
Was thinking specifically of the media, actually, and Toby, your particular challenge here. I mean, there are micropayments around some media organisations at the moment. It is quite a challenge, obviously, to fund the creators of decent content these days. But certainly on the open source front, I mean, there are all manner of tools that can help resource those sorts of services. So have a good look. Sorry, that's all I can add.
I just wanted to tie together actually two comments just there. So you're talking about sort of micropayments and funding and Kickstarter and so on for small software things, and the speaker just before talking about our can-do attitude and sort of getting things done in New Zealand. I think we are at a little bit of a golden age of kind of the app, the sort of the cell phone app, and apps online based on things like Amazon EC2 and App Engine, where I as an individual can build something that, if it's great, suddenly has this incredible worldwide distribution, is a relatively small thing in terms of the amount of work I need to do if it's a really great idea. And I can scale it up using, for example, backends from App Engine or EC2 or various other sort of cloud computing infrastructure. This is kind of perfectly suited, to the sort of funding we have in New Zealand, which is probably at a smaller scale than you can access in the US, but it's also a perfect fit for our sort of number 8 wire approach. I think it is a huge advantage for New Zealanders that we sort of get stuck in and do things. Because in today's environment, getting stuck in and doing things is exactly the way to build something. You don't need to make a huge plan and have 100 software engineers to build something pretty amazing. You will eventually, if the idea is going to grow. So there's a sort of a question of what happens after that initial thing. But that prototype phase, that app phase, is something that can be funded and can be built and should be built by New Zealanders.
Well, Instagram, 15 people sold for $1 billion to Facebook.
We need a few of those in New Zealand. Yeah.
Toby.
Yeah, crowdfunding is nascent in New Zealand, but developing quite fast. The Kickstarter is the one we all know about, and there's a very encouraging example in terms of journalism in the US. About 3 or 4 months ago, a project called Matter, a science publication, was put up there, and they raised $100,000 US, which was very many times more than what they'd asked for. And I mean, it's distorted by the fact that it was the first thing of its type. But one of the reward levels, if you contributed $200 US or something, you got to take a virtual seat on the virtual editorial board. So it actually lends itself back towards that idea of developing a conversation with interested parties, readers, and so on.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
So I'm Susie Wiles from the University of Auckland, and I've just done some crowdfunding for science. So there's a thing called the Sci-Fund Challenge, and it's really small amounts of money, but we basically, we've just had round 2. There were 75 scientists from all over the world who took part. We went out and used our networks to raise money. I made 6,000 6,000 New Zealand dollars, which was basically 150% of what I was expecting. So I think it does work. We made 100,000 US dollars for science in 4 weeks. So I think it's here to stay. But our universities have got no idea what to do with us. And they're all like, oh, did you write a budget for that? And oh, we're not really sure what to do with that. I don't think they're going to take any money in overheads, thankfully. But, you know, so it's happening. It's happening. But it's people, it's networks. And I think the point I want to make, what I was really astonished by, my husband said to me, you're going to do this, and everybody you know is going to give you money because you're middle class and they have disposable income. That's all the money you're going to get. Half of the people who contributed to my project, I don't know. They are strangers to me. Half of them are in New Zealand, half of them are in the rest of the world. And it's just by working bloody hard on Twitter, on Facebook, on getting everybody I know to put it out there, that we made the money. And as we build our networks, this is how, this I think is a really good way of communicating our science and getting a little bit of something back. So it's going to work, I think.
Thanks, Susie. Over here, sir.
I'm Matt Ruglis. I'm a naval meteorologist, which sounds like an opening for Alcoholics Anonymous. During one of the several interludes in a meandering naval career, I was a wildlife cameraman. And I have this nagging guilt in the back of my mind that the sort of thing we were peddling in series like Blue Planet, which is probably the only one that I made that you will have heard of, was a pristine view of the natural environment. And getting over the message that actually the natural world is in problems is extraordinarily difficult. And I think we need some slightly more imaginative attempts to show or to portray the actual state of the natural world rather than this sort of blue, shiny picture that I was peddling. David Attenborough, who during his national service was a naval meteorologist, has attempted had several goes at this, but he's the kind of programs he made just disappeared without trace compared to all the others. So I'm sorry if you feel the natural world is in a good state after what I've done and colleagues of mine have done.
Thank you. Yeah.
Anthony Poole, University of Canterbury. I'm a geneticist. So I really enjoyed this morning's panel. I thought there were a lot of things in there that were a foil or a response to some of the things that were discussed yesterday afternoon. I just wanted to bring up some of those. I guess there were 3 things that really struck me in terms of sound bites. One was this point of airplanes, getting to meet people, the sort of slow food, slow journalism, and then are we a serious country? All of those things resonated with me as a scientist, because one thing I think hasn't come across so far is that we scientists, we are an odd bunch in the way that we think. And I don't mean how we communicate, I mean in similar ways to these people, we quite like the idea of things being free and giving them away. And we like the idea, we know that the reality of getting from A to B is not very easy. If we were trying to solve a problem for you, and if it were jolly easy, it would be done already. So the first thing I wanted to say about getting serious, are we a serious country, is the value of science isn't necessarily in saying, I'm going to apply my skills to answer that problem over there. We know that applied science is a great idea in principle, but it's actually very difficult. I do something that's utterly useless in that respect. I work on the origin of life. So the thing that I work on that's closest to what we've seen so far is the story of Maui and his brothers. That has no direct financial value to this country as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if there is one. Maybe somebody else will find one. But part of being a serious country, I think, is saying, let's not answer the questions that are right in front of us. Let's be proper scientists, and let's say, right, let's see if we can do some serious work like other people in the rest of the world feel they're entitled to do. The second thing was with respect to airplanes and silos that was mentioned yesterday. I think part of the idea of networking is I don't think I should actually have to talk to every scientist in this country. I should talk to the people who are the most relevant to me to answer the questions I'm working on. not everybody in this country is necessarily going to be the most relevant scientist. I should get to know them and see whether there's a synergy, but I guess in a sense, if we force ourselves to just interact within New Zealand, we'll create a slightly bigger silo. And that's not really the way that I think science successfully works either in New Zealand or elsewhere. And the third thing was with respect to science communication. It was sort of, we were bagged on yesterday as being bad communicators. I'd say two things to that. One is science is actually very, very complicated, and I challenge any scientist here to stand up and give a soundbite describing somebody else's science in this room. We all know that it takes reading hundreds of papers, lots of background to do that, so it's not an easy thing to do. The second thing is, if you want us to do more of that, get rid of all the bloody bureaucracy we have to deal with. We'd happily do that. It's much more exciting than paperwork.
Yeah. Thank you.
I wanted to just make one more quick comment
Quickly.
with respect to IP. One thing that you may not realize about scientists is we don't really care about IP. If we did, we'd make companies. We're happy to give it away. We like Creative Commons. We like freedom of information. So please just come and take it from us.
Okay. Any comments in response here now? Okay, we'll go back over here.
Amen
to Creative Commons.
Just one thing, back on the point about basic science and about the shame of discovering the origins of life. I just gave a talk at Canterbury, and I tend to do a lot of research and think hard about, you know, if for example, Christchurch is going to regrow partly as a tech center, how do we emulate somewhere like Silicon Valley? So I did a lot of reading and looked back at what was it that made Silicon Valley great. And it was a fantastic university that was founded by a philanthropist that was doing great basic science and engineering. But then it was there was a huge amount of government funding through the NSF, the National Science Foundation, and the Defense Department actually, pouring lots of money in for various projects, which were in the end completely unrelated to what made Silicon Valley great. But what happened was that a few key entrepreneurs and a dean, Terman, who was a sort of bridged the gap partly because of the war between research and technology. A few of those companies spun out and created enough of a critical mass that led to basically the semiconductor revolution and the software revolution and so on. And so I'm not saying anything new. Everybody knows that funding of basic research will eventually lead to great things in technology. But I found it really interesting to look through that specific example and sort of draw the thread through. And so I think we do need to continue to fund this basic research. We've got to fund high quality research by ambitious people who have huge amounts of energy. And then either them or their students or people in their orbit are going to get excited and found a company and do amazing things. It's not really a predictable thread, but we've seen before that it does happen.
Thanks, Craig.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Chris Bean, and I'm from the Ministry of Māori Development, and I also have a background in science. I would just like to say that I feel really lucky to be here and amongst all you amazing people, and really feel the incredible aura and experience that everyone has. And one thing I was thinking about, maybe something tangible that could come out of this forum, is enhancing connectivity between even just the people that are in this room. There's such a breadth of experience and disciplines here, and actually just something that I did the other day was I was looking for a mentor, and I had a quick Google online, and I couldn't really find anything. I mean, there was something like Project K for high school students, and I think there's a business mentoring service if you're already, you know, productive for 6 months or something. But there wasn't really anything to connect experienced, scientists and entrepreneurs with perhaps younger folk and others. So what I thought may be really interesting is to see, perhaps just starting with this collection of people, is, you know, if there's one thing you want to do today, you know, talk to someone and make a connection that you can have an ongoing kind of appointment with, and just as a sounding board. And this can work both horizontally and vertically, you know, between different disciplines and different experience levels. So.
You need to talk to Alf Eldridge from McDiarmid Institute. He's doing exactly the same thing. Yeah. So we'll introduce you to him. Yeah.
Cheers.
Ian Taylor.
Yeah, Ian Taylor from Raupunga, just down the road. Very quickly, I'm on the MSI board. I don't know if anybody from here is still here, but just a thought. I am absolutely staggered every month as I look at the businesses and applications that come through for grants from the MSI board. So that's one resource that maybe we give to Catalyst. Catalyst figures out how we get this back to the scientists so that we can all see what's happening there. We've talked about it for months down there, how we do it, and nothing happens. So here's a DUI. You go to the MSI, get that database and put it together with science. The thing about travelling, last week I was in London. Next Friday I go back to London. So we do a lot of travelling. We're going back because somebody's asked us to come up with a way of tracking balls better than Hawkeye. So if anybody here is in the science area is working on ball tracking, I'll be out there at morning tea. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Any comments? All right, we'll move on. Sir.
Yes, my name's Peter Allport. I'm here as chairman of Paul Calhoun's inspired company, Magritech. We're marketing all around the world, but I want to just take off that hat for a minute and put on another hat I wear. I'm also the honorary Mongolian consul in New Zealand, and I want to just pose a question to the forum. How many people in this room speak Mandarin?
Wow.
Idiot.
Yeah. Well, about 12 months ago, Standard Chartered Bank produced a report, or sponsored a report, that looked at, over the next 30 years, the movement of industrial activity and employment and wealth creation, and that showed, and they did this with big green circles all over the globe, and that showed a huge shift from Europe and the Americas into Asia, centered on China. So, I inject this thought into the forum. We've heard a lot about the tyranny of distance. The tyranny of that distance is being halved for us without us having to do anything. So what are we doing about that? I've been traveling to Mongolia on a regular basis. I'm up there about 4 or 5 times a year, and I've been doing that for the last 20 years. Every time I go there, I learn a little bit more about the uniqueness of an Asian culture. I leave to get to Ulaanbaatar. Probably a lot of you have never even heard of it. But to get there, I fly out of Auckland at about 11:30 on a Saturday evening, and by 5 o'clock the next afternoon, I'm in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. The tyranny of distance is getting less and less and less, and we don't have to do a damn thing about it other than learn Mongolian or learn Chinese or learn Indonesian. Our markets are coming to us. There is a continental drift, and in terms of connectedness, it behoves us to play our part and learn about those cultures. Thank you.
Okay. And we'll finish off with David Winter.
So hi, I'm David Winter, University of Otago and Alan Wilson Centre. And if you think reading comments underneath MBR articles are depressing, imagine being the guy that writes the article and finds out that he's part of a shady scientific cabal that's trying to deny the genius of Ken Ring. But I just wanted to make the point that we sort of actually heard from the panel that we can't rely on MBR or Stuff or New Zealand Herald to write good science journalism because it's not in their interests. What we need to do is actually have a society, or if we want to have a reasonable debate, what we need to have is a society that values science and understands science as a process rather than an authority. And when an article comes up that's just terrible journalism, they just don't stand for it. So we're about tangibles today, so how are you going to contribute to that? If you're a scientist here, the way to contribute to that is if Peter or Toby or Rebecca Presley's here rings you up and wants to talk to you about your science, talk to them and put yourself in the story. And maybe this bit's self-promotion, but also value your colleagues that will actually stick their neck out and contribute to those debates. So thanks.
Thanks, David. Any comments on that? Okay. Peter?
I would like to comment on that last point. It's critical. We are dealing with a media, some people accepted, where anti-scientism is rife. We actually have a lot of anti-scientism in the world. If you look at Britain, and I don't know how many of you read the book, The Geek's Manifesto. If you haven't, everybody should go and buy it now to see how the scientific community has combined and activated to start to deal with the misconceptions about science that exist. It's compulsory reading for everybody in this room. We've seen it deal with issues of the homeopathy debate, for example, how the chiropractic debate, which occurred around libel suits for scientists making comments, and I can't deal with it all from my office. I mean, we have seen, the broadsheet papers in New Zealand repeatedly put quite misleading comments about science in the paper. I read a paper an article in the Herald over Christmas, which stated that having a fever in pregnancy was good for your baby. Yeah, if you want a brain-damaged baby or a baby with arthrogryposis, yeah, it's great. But the point is the stuff is coming out all the time. We need the scientific community to be reacting to this nonsense. That means letters to editors, op-eds, whatever. You cannot, we are having an increasingly anti-scientific discourse in the media, and if you look at what's happened in Britain, there's been a large reaction to change it.
Mr. Peter, this one, if I may. So why have we let this new ministry drop the name science and replace it with this mamby-pamby innovation?
If the media would turn off their, go off record for a moment. The fact is there was large lobbying against it. Part of the problem is around the world, most of these aggregated ministries do not have science in their name. The minister had made up his mind. There was a lot of lobbying against it. But where was the lobbying from? It was from one or two organisations. Royal Society wrote a very good letter. I'm struggling to, I think the universities might have written a letter. But beyond that, where were the 10,000 letters from the 10,000 scientists in New Zealand? Because volumes of email matter.
Yeah. Well, I'd just like to wrap up really by thanking our panellists, especially Craig and David, who came so far to be here. And just a few themes, a few tangibles that have really come out of this session, just a few of them. Connecting the business community with science. I like your Book of Boffin idea. You need to be talking to the ATI about that, because they've got this big challenge ahead of them of how to do exactly that. There's an app for that, as you say. More funding of sabbaticals and getting out into the world. I think this is something that we need to collectively look at. Where's the funding for this going to come? And loosening up the schedules for people so they can spend more time overseas. Knowing our markets better, having better intel on our markets, and not necessarily being so relaxed when we go into these markets, as Craig said. It doesn't go down very well in a meeting in New York. We need better cohesion around our crowdfunding and our crowdsourcing initiatives. As Susie said, there's huge latent potential here, $6,000 in a few weeks for her science project. There's a lot of potential out there. People can make micropayments very easily now. We just need a bit of structure around how it's done here in New Zealand. Cutting through the bureaucracy to encourage science communication in universities and making it a valued part of what you do as a researcher. That's something that I'm a huge proponent of as the head of the Science Media Centre. That's one of the key barriers that we face in getting scientists out to talk, is that they don't get tangible value from that, either in their PBRF or in the way that their superiors look at them. It needs to be recognised as it is in other countries. Connectivity between people in this room is a great idea, and that mentoring thing, which was mentioned, and Alf is getting that off the ground, so that's something that we can all contribute to. I'm signed up as a mentor, and hopefully many of you will as well. Mike's got to go to MSI to get that database that Ian talked about. That's got to be a must-do, and we all need to read the Geeks Manifesto. So download that onto your Kindle or pick that up. Just one idea that I'm going to work on. Toby talked about ProPublica, which is an amazing model. In 2010, it was the first online organisation to win a Pulitzer Prize. So that just shows how the game is changing. So I got a bit of money to go out there to go and see ProPublica early next year. I'm going to spend 2 months going to ProPublica, the Centre for Public Integrity, the Centre for Health Reporting in California. I'm going to look at all of these models, because I think, and the Science Media Centre is effectively doing this in science with a team of 4 or 5 crack journalists funded, I don't know, through crowdfunding or through philanthropy or something, you could change the game in journalism in New Zealand. Not by replacing the mainstream media, but by working with APN, Fairfax, TVNZ to break stories, to mount investigations together. I'll write up that research in Pacific Journalism Review early next year and take it to the media, and hopefully we can kick along some ideas, and I know Toby's going to help me to do that. So I think we've got heaps of cool ideas here. Hopefully something will come off them in a tangible format, and I'd just like to thank everyone who contributed for all your great comments and questions. Thank you. Cool. Great. Thank you. Thanks.